Welcome, all of you. Thank you very much. My name is Ethan Shagan. I'm a professor in the Department of History. It's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Dominic Erdozain to Berkeley. Dr. Erdozain received his PhD from Cambridge University and taught the history of Christianity for many years at King's College London in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies. And in that position, he wrote an important first academic book entitled The Problem of Pleasure, Sport, Recreation, and the Crisis of Victorian Religion, published in 2010. And he also laid the groundwork for a collection of essays entitled The Dangerous God, Christianity and the Soviet Experiment, which finally appeared last year after a long gestation. So you can already see he is a scholar of both great learning and eclectic interests. But then he did something that many academics talk about, but few of us actually do, and that is he resigned his tenured job and moved to Atlanta with his spouse so that she could take her dream job, and he now actually writes books for a living. And in 2015, he managed the feat of publishing a book that was both influential among scholars and a commercial success, entitled The Soul of Doubt, The Religious Roots of Unbelief, from Luther to Marx. In that book, he argues that the roots of doubt are not an intellectual skepticism about the existence of divinity, but rather an ethical skepticism about the pernicious and hypocritical work that religion had performed in the world. Thus, the great opponents of Christianity in modern Europe, from the French philosophes to the Marxists, were continuing a spiritual project begun by Christian radicals in the Reformation, who attempted to liberate society from the violent consequences of dogmatism and intolerance. The book is often dazzling and always thought-provoking for both specialists and non-specialists. And his new work once again leaps across other scholars' specialties. He is now finishing a book-length study, again intended for a broad public audience, on Christianity and gun culture in modern America, from which his talk today is drawn. Please welcome Dominic Erdozain.
Thank you very much for an extremely kind introduction. I always say to people getting married, don't ask your wife to change her name because there will be payback. Thank you very much for having me. Being an independent scholar is a bit like being Homer Simpson. Plenty of time for television, but respect not always forthcoming. I'm sure it was Homer who said, "I wish just once someone would call me sir," without adding, "You're making a scene." The thing that people say to me most when I tell them I'm writing a book on guns is, "Good luck with that." The assumption is that nothing will change. My response to that is that it is changing every day. I remember my undergraduate tutor telling me not to use the phrase status quo because cultures are never static. The gun culture is moving, in some ways contracting, in other ways expanding and sharpening its logic. Now, I don't have extravagant ambitions as to what history can achieve, but I take my cue from the social theorist Geoffrey Vickers, who said that questions of public health float upon cultural waters, often misunderstood by those who address them. History sets the goals of public health, he wrote. And it does so partly by defining the terms in which a problem is framed. If we want to travel, quote, beyond the boundaries of the known, he urged, we need to question our conceptual apparatus. We need to understand how language defines a problem. I was on a tour of a middle school last week, and we asked some 7th graders what their favourite school project had been. Without hesitation, they volunteered a recent event called a word funeral, for phrases that had consistently frustrated their studies and plagued their conversation. Eulogies were offered, respects were paid, and the offending terms were buried in the schoolyard. I immediately thought of words in my own field that might be banned if not buried: trope, nuance, you know who you are. But in respect to the gun debate, there is no question which phrase cries out for retirement. Quote, the law-abiding citizen. From the National Rifle Association to advocates of gun control, from the New York Times to the Supreme Court opinions of Antonin Scalia, the needs of, quote, law-abiding citizens represent the common sense of the gun debate. But it is a flawed, if not empty, concept, and one that takes me to the heart of what I want to talk about today, which is the relationship between innocence and violence. Gun rights are premised on a distinction between dangerous people and decent, law-abiding citizens, which dissolves upon analysis. If, as I hope to show, this basic dichotomy is false, the question is how this essential dualism of the good and the damned came to be. So in the second and third parts of my paper, I want to talk about how patriotism and Protestant theology created a doctrine of innocence. My thesis is that gun culture is not a Second Amendment issue, it's a chosen people issue. I want to suggest that the innocence of the law-abiding citizen is a hangover from older traditions of civil religion, an innocence born of abstractions about freedom and national mission rather than the facts on the ground. Indeed, the reason I consider the gun culture religious, despite its weakened relationship to organised Christianity, is precisely this affinity for abstraction over detail. And here it's hard to ignore the symbolic significance of federal restrictions on research into gun violence established in 1996. When Congress diverts funds away from a public health problem out of suspicion that the results may tend towards gun control, you start to perceive the kind of ground that the game is being played on. You keep the facts, we'll keep the freedom. The author of that amendment has since expressed regret about his decision to prevent the Centres for Disease Control from gathering data on gun violence. And the truth is that the evidence we do have pulls in subversive directions, highlighting what many of us consider the mythological texture of the gun culture. The romantic scenario of good guys defending their families from bad guys is not supported by the criminology or public health literature. Indeed, the brilliance of much of this recent material is the ability to step back from moralising categories to examine the unglamorous and domestic nature of gun violence in America. Think not of chiselled saints taking down violent intruders, think of ordinary men killing people they already know. And the report that prompted the ban on CDC research in 1996 was a study showing that the presence of a gun in the home increased the risk of homicide. I mean, some of you will be familiar with this material. Other studies have debunked the self-defense argument for gun possession, showing that less than 1% of homicides in private residences involve the shooting of an intruder. And there is a prosaic and poignant quality to this literature. The US Department of Justice report of 2001 classified the largest discernible cause of murder as, quote, arguments. As David Hemingway explains in Private Guns, Public Health, a large percentage of homicides occur during altercations over such matters as love, money, and domestic problems involving acquaintances, neighbours, lovers, and family members. Drink, he adds, is often a factor. Everyone is a law-abiding citizen until they're not. Criminologist Tom Gabor makes the point even more sharply in a book summarising much of the recent data. The notion that gun violence may be attributed to, quote, a criminal class so different from the rest of the population as to virtually constitute a distinct species, he urges, is a fiction. Quote, felony-type killings that occur during the course of a rape, robbery, burglary, or other crime, he insists, are rare events. Quote, if these are the bad guys the gun lobby is referring to, their murders account for less than 4% of all gun deaths. And as he explains, many people who commit violent crimes have no history of violence. Even the most extreme of offenders often have no criminal record. The vast majority of deaths, he writes, are the results of arguments, personal crises, and catastrophic errors, rather than the premeditated acts of bad guys. Even mass murders, Gabor goes on to explain, confuse the Manichaean logic of the gun culture. Mass murderers, it seems, are too normal in their movements and too varied in their specific motivations to fall with any clarity into a foreign category. The most common description of the mass murderer, concluded a study from Northeastern University, is, quote, a white male who has a history of frustration and failure, who is socially isolated and lacking support systems, who externalizes blame onto others, who suffers some loss or disappointment perceived to be catastrophic, and has access to a powerful enough weapon. Finally, there is the great slander, the scapegoat of mental illness. As the editors of the New England Journal of Medicine write in a scathing critique of public discourse on guns, quote, most people who are violent are not mentally ill, and most people who are mentally ill are not violent. So the principle of going after felons and keeping guns out of the hands of the mentally ill while arming the law-abiding citizen is self-defeating, even though that was the very logic of the Heller ruling of 2008, where the Supreme Court declared for the first time that the Second Amendment confers an individual right to bear arms. From the sober, salt-of-the-earth character at the centre of the case to the friends of the court briefs submitted by people like Ted Cruz, the whole debate centred around the need of law-abiding citizens to protect themselves from a criminal other. And in his majority opinion, overturning the District of Columbia ban on handguns, Antonin Scalia demonstrated the practical side of this theory of innocence, what we might call the myth of efficacy. Scalia explicitly commended the value of a loaded handgun as protection against a violent intruder, suggesting that it is easy to use, quote, for those without the upper body strength to hold a rifle, and it can be pointed at a burglar with one hand while the other hand dials the police. Exactly. This, commented in one position, was pure fantasy, revealing an ignorance of the risks associated with handguns and a misunderstanding of how the body behaves under stress. But such is the power of an idea. Now there is a kind of superstition here about the effectiveness of weapons and the goodness of the gun owner, as if the two go hand in hand. These debates remind me of an article on the practice of bearing arms in the Philadelphia Gazette of 1835. Written with passion, humour and exasperation, the writer proclaimed the bottom line on trust in guns. Quote, "No one knows himself. Everybody believes himself wise, competent and just, but nobody can be sure of how they will act or perform under pressure. Quote, where is the man," challenged the author, "who has so completely chained the fiend in his nature that no incident will call up the dark passions of his bosom?" The author quoted a man condemned to our penitentiary for murder, who said, "You are one moment innocent and beloved, one burst of passion and you are a murderer." So guns have never been merely tools or pieces of technology. They rest on a body of assumptions about guilt and innocence, danger and self-defense. But the power of these assumptions, as Caroline Light argues in a recent book, is not only in the making of a liberalised gun culture, but in the policing of it. Not only are stand your ground laws riddled with simplistic ideas about who is and who is not capable of crime, their interpretation follows a similar script. She demonstrates. When good guys turn out to be bad guys, in other words, the law often treats them as good guys all the same. The framing of these laws, she argues, rests on a set of coded fears, and even when the facts contradict the stereotype, the fears too often carry the day. And the most obvious case she cites was the death of Trayvon Martin in 2012 and the subsequent exoneration of his killer. Gun rights, Light argues, sound democratic, but they function like a divine right of kings. That's my phrase, not hers. The gun movement, she suggests, is a pseudo-democracy in which white males stand their ground and others suffer the consequences. Her aim was, quote, to penetrate the veneer of equality and empowerment promised by gun advocates and expose the violent exclusions that have become second nature to them. Language of equality and freedom, she suggests, covers a much older politics of racist and patriarchal privilege. In practice, she writes, gun rights are reserved only for the select few. This, I think, is progress, because it shifts the emphasis away from the technicalities of the Second Amendment to the wider dynamics of the culture. And the fact that juries so often buy into the mythical dualities of a gun culture shows that the problem is much broader than the lobbying activity of the National Rifle Association. It is, as the authors of that New England Journal of Medicine article I've already quoted argue, too easy to blame the NRA for a tradition of gun violence. Gun rights that they write should not be treated as a foreign pathogen external to our body politic, but as an organic development from our own mutated cells. So the problem is older, they suggest, and more central to American history than liberal opinion typically acknowledges. You may be aware of Michael Belial's disastrous attempt to exceptionalize guns in America by writing them out of the early history of the Republic, or at least marginalising them. Straining to prove that early America was not addicted to the gun, Berkeley essentially doctored his sources. But there are soft versions of this fallacy in the argument that gun culture was invented by the gun makers in the 19th century, or in the liberal bromide that gun rights are the fetish of appraised conservatism. America's psychic investment in the gun, to borrow Joan Burbick's marvellous phrase, runs deeper than this wide-eyed conservatism. Indeed, it strikes me that some critics, such as Gary Wills, have mistaken symptoms for the cause, attacking the fetish of the gun while celebrating some of the values on which it rests. Now, Wills is a fine scholar, not someone you necessarily want to pick a fight with. He's written some stinging critiques of the modern gun rights movement. In a celebrated New York Review of Books article, he took apart the so-called standard model of Second Amendment studies, showing how the individual rights theory cannot be honestly inferred from the malicious provision of the Bill of Rights. More recently, he's written of gun rights as a modern Moloch, a bloodletting cult that sacrifices human lives to an inanimate idol. So there's no question about his passion on the subject. Yet his idea that this Moloch steers all rational judgment upon politics, the Constitution and national welfare seems to exonerate the wider culture from its contribution. He's saying in effect that this is our Achilles heel, a weakness that has no relationship to our better selves. On this view, Charlton Heston and Wayne LaPierre are monstrous intruders upon the political stage, quote, the high priests of a religious fundamentalism that has utterly distorted our constitutional thinking. Now, right as Gary Wills may be about the distortion of the Second Amendment, I don't think he can push a figure as mainstream as Charlton Heston into the land of un-American crazy, as he's trying to. And it's fascinating to find Heston, in an eloquent if strident speech at Harvard in 1999, quoting the same Gettysburg Address that Wills hails as the antidote to narrow sectional strife. In his Pulitzer Prize-winning book on the words that remade America, Wills argues that the Civil War was grim, but it recreated the nation. And Lincoln's genius for Wills was to transform the blood and carnage of a butchered campaign into something rich and meaningful. It was a kind of alchemy of words. Now, there are a lot of differences between Lincoln and the cruder partisans on both sides of the conflict, of course, but it does not occur to Wills that his generous appraisal of the logic of total war is kindred to the civilian militarism he so despises in the NRA, namely that freedom comes at a price, and America's freedoms are the ones on which the rest of the world depends. In fact, Wills constantly praises Lincoln for framing war in terms resolutely abstract, soaring grandly above the painful details of names, regiments, and botched circumstances, even though this is the modus operandi of the gun movement. Talk about freedom, not killing, national destiny, not the individual life. Lincoln's phrase, "Let us have faith that right makes might," and his more famous comment about America as the last best hope of earth, together distill core ideas of the religion of the gun. It is a fervent moralism married to an anchoring hope that even in failure, a sacred destiny is assured. The progress of our arms is a kind of cosmic affair. It is this peculiar confidence experienced collectively in war and privately in civilian life that flows from the primary sources on guns. So the discourse of the law-abiding citizen, I think, is a doctrine of national innocence, and we can't condemn the one while celebrating the other. Charlton Heston's tenure as president of the NRA reveals the power of this patriotic heritage and the agility of firearms innocence. Why us, he asked, when the NRA was made to feel unwelcome in Denver, not long after the Columbine high school shooting of 1999. Why us? This is our country. As Americans, we're free to travel wherever we want in our broad land. Heston did not think an organisation that campaigned for gun rights bore any responsibility for a mass murder. When an isolated event terrible event occurs, he complained, our phones ring demanding that the NRA explain the inexplicable. But, he countered, the NRA was a body of law-abiding, armed, ethical people. Gentle warriors for freedom, in other words, empowered by, quote, the majesty of the Second Amendment that our fathers so divinely captured. The focus of his speech was not the gun, but freedom and the special promises of America. Crazed gunmen ceased to be Americans, and no one was tougher on criminals than the NRA. Guns were the instruments of a more basic principle of liberty, and liberty was intrinsic to Americanism. And that was his word. You start to see why the argument cannot be won on the ground of common sense or homicide statistics. The law-abiding citizen is a patriot, and since murderers cease to be patriots, they're not our problem. One of the most important dates in the modern gun movement, and an illustration of this theme, was Ronald Reagan's speech at the annual convention of the NRA in 1983. A flowing presidential endorsement of an organisation only 6 years into a new, more aggressive phase of its existence. Again, we can argue that this organisation has hijacked the Second Amendment and succumbed to an ultra-modern individualism, which may be true, but Reagan's awesome confidence in popular sovereignty was not conjured out of postmodern air. It was anchored to a story of national destiny and the privileges won by George Washington and Abraham Lincoln. God is on our side. He's with our troops, and you, the humble civilian, are fighting in the same cause. We think of gun rights as something to fight against government, but Reagan, like almost any edition of the American Rifleman, interlaced them with a story of national righteousness and necessary defence. He honoured his audience as collaborators in statecraft, delivering hushed updates on overseas missions and likening the NRA's struggle for gun rights with his own efforts to get Congress to equip the army. Quote, if they can put their lives on the line to protect our way of life, then by golly, we can give them the weapons, he protested. And the same was true at home. As we crack down on criminals, he continued, we're trying to move further forward on another front to reform the firearms laws which needlessly interfere with the rights of legitimate gun owners like yourselves. Gun control? That was for weaklings and criminals. The nasty truth was that criminals will get weapons whatever you do. Reagan placed the innocence of the law-abiding citizen alongside the innocence of the nation, and he juxtaposed the critics of military budgets with the advocates of gun control. Quote, it isn't America that attacks and occupies other countries, he maintained against the former. Against the latter, he complained, don't they understand that most violent crimes are not committed by decent, law-abiding citizens? He even went out of his way to praise a civilian outfit such as Arizona's Sun City Posse, a group that has had, in his words, great success roping in the bad guys. Now, it's tempting to agree with Osher Gray Davidson that the only thing that changed for Reagan when he swapped films for politics was the clothes. But Hollywood was the propagator, not the inventor, of the romance with guns. Reagan's speech is a doctrine of American exceptionalism coiled into an attack on that mistaken spirit of compromise that produced the 1968 Gun Control Act. It is, in a sense, a nationalism turned on what the nation has come to be. And it shows that the gun is not a thing in itself, racing to an undeserved prominence. It is suspending in a narrative, and the narrative is theological. Reagan concluded his speech with a homiletic flourish. Standing up for America means standing up for the God who has so blessed this land. If we could just keep remembering that Moses brought down from the mountain 10 commandments, not 10 suggestions, and if those of us who live for the Lord could remember that he wants us to love our Lord and our neighbour, then there's no limit to the problems we could solve or the mountains we could climb together as a mighty force for good. The United States remains the last best hope for a mankind plagued by tyranny and deprivation, he added, with the all-important homage to Lincoln. And then he quoted the Apostle Paul. One day we will say, we fought the good fight, we finished the race, we kept the faith. And to our children and our children's children we can say, we did all that could be done in the brief time that was given us here on earth. Now it feels uncharitable to note that the good work he's referring to here is the dismantling of an already feeble Gun Control Act. It is as if the 20th century never happened. But Reagan's pieties make a larger point about the potency of patriotism, and it's here, I think, that the origins of a gun culture may be found. In his study on the American mind, Henry Steele Commager offers an intriguing comment on the difference between Americans and Europe in the 20th century. 2 world wars, he wrote, of the emblematic American of the period, 2 world wars had not induced in him a sense of sin that was instinctive with most old world peoples. Where Europeans had been humiliated by either defeat or the loss of extensive empires, America stayed on a winning streak. While the old world roiled, it was still possible to quote John Winthrop with a straight face. I'll never forget Martin Luther King's comment about British decline, delivered on the occasion of Ghana's independence in 1957. I looked at Britain, and I thought about the Britain that could boast the sun never sets on our great empire. And I say now she has gone to the level that the sun hardly rises on the British Empire. That was before Brexit. It's tempting to conclude that American patriotism is no different from any other, her misfortune simply to survive. And I find it helpful here to consult a writer like Tolstoy, who found the similarities of French, Russian, German and British patriotisms around 1900 more compelling than the differences. And Tolstoy's perception of the religious quality of patriotism is germane to our theme. Patriotism, for the great Russian novelist, is always religious insofar as it inverts the meaning of violence, declaring holy what is unholy, turning murder into honour. And as he wrote to a much younger correspondent, quote, "Love is a very dangerous word. You know that very bad acts are committed in the name of love for the family, worse ones still in the name of love of country." Patriotism for Tolstoy was a kind of hypnosis that enabled sane and intelligent people to do terrible things. And it was for Tolstoy ultimately a contraction of a Christian demand for unconditional love, where, quote, "Christianity demands a sacrifice of one's life for the good of all men, patriotism asks of its disciple that he sacrifice his life for the good of his countrymen." So when you describe the deity as, quote, "that almighty friend of Britain," as one Victorian writer did, the game is up. The question is how a religious tradition proclaiming the love of God for a created world swerves into this kind of particularity. And the answer, in a sense, is theology. A theology of a kind that can reorder the contents of the Bible at will. In her new book, Loaded, A Disarming History of the Second Amendment, Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz reaches back into the colonial period for the basic DNA of a gun culture, arguing that race is the sum and substance of gun love. But it's also in this period that a theology of violence emerges, and it's through theology that the darker realities of violence assume this glow of innocence. In his book Power and Innocence, A Search for the Sources of Violence, the psychologist Rollo May made a distinction between natural innocence, found in children, and pseudo-innocence, usually found in adults, which is a common defence against admitting or confronting one's own power. He quotes Arthur Miller, "To perceive somehow our own complicity with evil is a horror not to be borne. It is much more reassuring to see the world in terms of totally innocent victims and totally evil instigators of the monstrous violence we see all about. At all costs, never disturb our innocence." Now, pseudo-innocence may be found in individuals who project evil onto those around them but never see it in themselves, and it may be found in nations. And in America, May writes, pseudo-innocence has a history as long as the countries. A chosen people set sail from England, turning its back on a Europe that stood for sin, injustice, aristocratic exploitation, and religious persecution. And this meant for May that America and her necessary violence would automatically stand for the opposite. Righteousness, justice, democracy, and freedom of conscience. And the narrative of chosenness, for May, led not so much to hypocrisy as a kind of moral amnesia, a sublime indifference to the human costs of conquest. It was not only the zealots who subscribed to these ideas he emphasises, he quotes Benjamin Franklin, casually reflecting that, quote, "If it be the design of Providence to extirpate these savages in order to make room for the cultivators of the earth, it seems not improbable that rum may be the appointed means. It has already annihilated all the tribes who formerly inhabited the sea coasts." The doctrine of chosenness turned English and then American self-interest into the will of God. It was a dance, a sidestep, converting the genocide of Indians into an act of providence. It may actually suggest that civilian homicide as well as warfare may be connected to this phenomenon of pseudo-innocence, adding that this violence exists side by side with a remarkable tenderness and warmth in the American character. We cannot escape the conclusion that some special conflicts must be present in the consciousness of Americans to account for the simultaneous existence of violence and tenderness. And here I appreciate this approach in contrast to some of the sort of cliches associated with people like D.H. Lawrence saying, the typical American is hard, whole, cold, it says cold, hard, stoic, indifferent to suffering. That's completely untrue. It's this blend of the humane, the charitable, and, in a sense, the conscious, free capacity to kill that fascinates people like Rollo May and those of us studying this. May finally concludes that the violence and the tenderness are linked, a potent sense of virtue and decency contributing to this denial of power. It is pseudo-innocence because it misrepresents the real dynamics of power, but it is honest insofar as it is truly believed and it's uncynically held. I think that's important. And at the risk of getting anecdotal, this is a paradox I've found alive and well among gun lovers. In theological terms, it's a paradox rooted in a doctrine of election. Take a character like Cotton Mather, a giant of intellectual endeavour, a man of boundless wit and extensive charities, a doting, lachrymose father who believed that charity was known in action, Christianity was known in action, not orthodoxy. Yet his own fiercely providential orthodoxy set limits to his charity. Mather, like his father Increase, believed that God had singled out New England for special treatment. They believed, in Increase Mather's cool phrase, quote, that the dealings of God with our nation and the dealings and with the nations of the world are very different. And this singular principle of identity seems to have governed their ethics of violence. And this tallies with what Caroline Knight is talking about in the era of Stand Your Ground, that identity rules judgment. In the same way with these Puritan writers, it's who we are that ultimately matters more than what you do. A theology of grace, in a sense, becomes a license to kill. The American colony was, for the Puritan mind, the English Israel, a covenanted community with special rights. A satirist put it with humour: voted that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Voted that the earth is given to the saints. Voted that we are the saints. But for Cotton Mather, it was a matter of intimate spirituality. We have been dandled in the lap of his providence, he wrote, showered with a singular and unparalleled mercy. We are the first among Christ's beloved and the most beautiful of his brides. For the unchosen, such love was costly. I think scholarship has been slow to detect the violence inherent within the predestinarian logic of the Puritans and the degree to which it governed their reading of the Bible. And this is part of how I see myself working within the history of Christianity, and sort of challenging some of these ideas. A recent biography of Mather describes him as the first evangelical and a man of resolute biblicism. But what's more apparent when you read him is the degree to which his theological template trumps the ethical demands of the New Testament, turning Jesus into Jehovah, effectively. To the very typological minds of the Mathers, the Indians were self-evidently heathens, or Amalekites and Canaanites, and slotted into a kind of typological model. And so their annihilation became a holy ordinance. Describing a massacre that took place during King Philip's War, Mather claimed the work for Jesus. Quote, the glorious Lord Jesus Christ, whom they had slighted, was with our army, and the day was wonderfully carried against the tawny infidels. Their city was laid in ashes, above 20 of their chief captains were killed. A proportional desolation cut off the inferior savages. Mortal sickness and horrid famine pursued the remainders of them, so we can hardly tell where any of them are left alive upon the face of the earth. Such was thy speedy vengeance, O blessed Jesus, on the heathen that would not know thee, nor call upon thy name. Mather is actually open about the entertainment value of his narrative, and gleeful in his accounts of human destruction, quoting a Spanish soldier who once declared, quote, that if we have a good cause, the smell of gunpowder in the field is as sweet as the incense of the altar. Mather follows this with a challenge, quote, let the reader judge after these things what scent there was in the gunpowder spent for 9 or 10 years together in our war with the Indian savages. What indeed? Baruch Spinoza would say that it was the scent of egoism or human aggression that rose from the barrel of a gun. He argued that religion becomes dangerous when it is particularized, and he considered the narrow logic of Calvinism a serial offender. Spinoza's reading of the New Testament was that it proclaimed a universal covenant, the message of Paul being that, quote, God is the God of all nations, that is, God is equally well disposed to all, and all men are equally under the law of sin, and that is why God sent his Christ to all nations, to free all men equally from the servitude of the law. I mean, massive repetition to make his point. It was, quote, unthinkable that a God of mercy could single out a single group for eternal favour and damn the rest. Reformed theologians, he suggested, were more inventive and more aggressive in the uses of the Bible than sceptical philosophers. Quote, there is nothing they interpret with less hesitation and greater boldness than the Scriptures, he complained. And I think there is truth to this analysis, and it's an angle that needs to be developed in relation to the alleged sort of heresies of pacifists and the way that church history has kind of normalised violence and sort of exceptionalised the New Testament's teaching on violence. You know, Tolstoy, I can't resist quoting again, you know, he says, it really is a choice you have to make, orthodoxy or the Sermon on the Mount. The problem for Spinoza was not religion in general, therefore, but theological assaults on the principle that, quote, God cares for all. Quakers, by contrast, tethered their pacifism to a theology of universal love and a principle of general revelation, that the light of Christ shines in everyone who comes into the world. Puritan violence, on the other hand, is relentlessly theological. It's traceable to a theology of salvation and a kind of closed model of redemption. Reading Mather on the Indian Wars is to recall something Alexander Yakovlev wrote about the relationship between Marxism and Soviet violence. Quote, if from the very beginning you are firmly convinced that the observed object is sentenced to death, and the collisions and conflicts you witness are only spasms of the expiring life, then conscience may retire. Ideas do not generate violence, but they are the great enablers. As Richard Slotkin has written of Cotton Mather, his problem is epistemological as much as it is ethical. He is separated from the realities of war by, quote, a gulf of incomprehension. He cannot see that he's dealing with fellow humans. Now, Mather's Magnalia Christi Americana was influential in the formation of American identity, and this providential logic that he articulates underwrites violence widely in the following 2 centuries. Francis Jennings has traced the doctrine into the 19th century, quoting Chief Justice John Marshall in 1823, describing native Indians as fierce savages and explaining that the law which regulates and ought to regulate the relations between conqueror and conquered was incapable of application to such a people. And this doctrine of election, Jennings argues, was only partly secularized in the period between the Mathers and the buccaneering presidency of Theodore Roosevelt. Others have written of, quote, the New Englandization of American thought in the early Republic, the evolution of America's God into the God of America, a cult of nationhood. And as Albert Weinberg showed in his classic study on Manifest Destiny, foreign policy was inherently theological in the 19th century. from the Monroe Doctrine to McKinley's adventures in the Caribbean and the Pacific. Enshrined in expansionism, he writes, was this dogma of the special mission. It was a period in which the will of God and the success of our arms achieved some sort of cosmic association. Although, as Weinberg dryly adds, it was a strangely anthropocentric theology in which God serves us, not the other way around, turning self-defense into a doctrine of aggression. And that's also, of course, Spinoza's point that God of terror is inherently anthropomorphic. We create a God in our image when we conceive God as suiting our needs and fighting our cause. Returning to Weinberg, quote, one might suppose that only an irresponsible exponent of natural law would assert the natural right of injuring another nation before it has displayed any hostile intent. The natural law was nothing against special election. Such was the logic of a gun culture. Samuel Colt and Oliver Winchester built their marketing strategies around the romance of the frontier and the justice of self-defense. But there was always a code within the code, a wink of divine preference. When African Americans replaced Indians as the resident other, an ideology of difference was ready and waiting. The gun in America reeks of white power, writes Joan Burbeck. It also reeks of this aristocracy of the spirit that can divide the world into discrete ontological categories. Protesting against Georgia's so-called Guns Everywhere Bill of 2014, a group of bishops issued a statement explaining their dissent. Our Christian faith has a more complex understanding of good guys and bad guys than the logic implicit in the legislation, they urged. Now, most people will not want to approach this problem from a religious standpoint, but it seems important to me that discussions about guns can address these cultural, pre-political dimensions of the subject. I share the ambition of scholars who wish to historicise aspects of the gun culture as a late modern phenomenon, a rights culture in extremis. I also think this faith in the law-abiding citizen speaks to older instincts of divide and rule, a moral glare that claims providence for power. As well as demythologizing the British Empire, Martin Luther King was the master of decentering debates by shifting the focus of responsibility. As he reasoned in a famous sermon, all people are interdependent, whether we realize it or not. We are all debtors to people that we do not know. Before we leave for our jobs in the morning, we are already beholden to more than half of the world. Now, gun zealots could learn from some of the connections between their rights and the realities of gun violence in America. But so could we, who have too often mirrored their Manichaean worldview by casting the problem as a merely right-wing fanaticism. I discovered only this week that the Peabodys, my wife's American family, were investors in the Winchester Repeating Arms Corporation. When I got over the brief moment of pride, it suddenly occurred to me that I'm connected to the problem I'm studying. It's not them, but us. So maybe Jeffrey Vickers was right, that history holds the answers. Thank you very much.
We have time for many questions, and I suspect there will be some.
I don't own guns, but I like guns, and one of the, I'll fess up, and one thing I assume is part of the story is the imagination that the guns would defend you not against the bad person, but against the state. That seems to me a kind of hardwired into the world of gun, so that within the story you're telling, there's a kind of split between the America that we are representing and the America that we are fearing, and that the gun sits right at that intersection between those two things. Yeah. That I don't know much about other people in this room who know a lot about guns. But I assume that that's a pretty big part, at least of one subsector of what you're calling a gun culture.
Yes, it is, but I suppose it's one that I expected to find more of, and that's where you sort of get into this idea of this kind of the slightly crankish developments of theories of insurrection. I mean, Gary Wills talks about this a lot in his New York Review of Books article, saying that it's a fairly modern thing, the idea of reading the Second Amendment as somehow authorising treason or fighting the government, because that certainly wasn't a long-standing view of the Second Amendment. But I think I was just struck with that Reagan speech, especially, that he's just interlacing individual gun rights with the national mission. And then you go back to the early NRA and the sense that they're doing the work that cooperating with the Roosevelt legislation in the 30s and fighting crime alongside the police, and also sort of some of the stuff on film with Richard Slotkin material, a surprising kind of alignment of police with sort of warriors for justice in the West. I agree that that's an element, but I expected it to be more prominent, and this sort of civil religion theme wasn't something I expected to be central.
This was a marvelous talk. Congratulations. I sat here listening and appreciate very much your grounding this in history and theology. And briefly, especially when you talked about Rollo May, you talked about psychology, and in particular, projecting evil onto the other. I'm wondering to ask you to reflect on whether the category of paranoia is useful in trying to understand this. I mean, paranoia is essentially, to project what you dislike about yourself out on upon another, and if you kind of assume that somebody is going to do something awful to you, and you can preemptively act. It seems to me that in that sense, stand your ground laws are kind of the paranoid Bill of Rights. That guy was going to do me bad, and so I was able to preemptively act against him. It seems to me that kind of license and giving legitimacy to the individual's conception of I was in danger is fundamental to the story.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating observation, particularly in relation to stand your ground. It's almost like passing laws to protect ourselves against ourselves, against people just like the way I feel. I'd be interested to go back to Hofstadter, because he of course wrote that essay, The Paranoid Style of American Politics, and he was the person who coined the phrase America as a gun culture. I'd love to develop it. I just think I probably need psychologists to say it. I don't want to sort of meddle too much in that terminology if I can't use it accurately, but I would love, as this develops, to collaborate more with other fields. I mean, we talked a bit about this today, Brian and I. I do think there's some exciting resonances, and there's just, I love the scientific literature, whether it's the medical stuff I was quoting earlier or the psychologists. It is so much more authoritative than some of us in the softer arts. So yeah, I'd like to develop it, but I wouldn't want to go further with the paranoia thing explicitly.
So yeah, thanks, that was great. So I guess I'm interested, you had some really interesting thoughts about the NRA as a little bit of a boogeyman, right, for liberals, and it's a symptom and not the disease. So I'd be interested just to hear you talk a little bit about, like, if you have any thoughts about sort of the theological, sort of as a theological conviction, like, so do you think that it's like a genuine theological conviction for most gun holders or for the NRA? Or are there people who harness it for evil or for, like, purposes of gun companies, right? Like, where does that sort of cynical gun power come in to the story?
Yeah, I think it's there all along. I think with someone like Cotton Mather, he passionately believes in the theology, but he also passionately has aligned his own ego with the the military needs of the hour, so to speak. I'm trying to talk about the religion of the gun as something that's kind of mutated out of a certain kind of Christianity, but it's no longer tethered. There's a great line in Joan Berwick's book Gun Show Nation where she talks to someone who puts together the lists, the mailing list for NRA, and they said something about, well, we don't need, our lists are not overwhelmingly full of sort of fundamentalists and evangelical Christians, but we have them anyway. So they're not necessarily at the forefront of activism, but they're strongly aligned with the cause. Robert Jones has done work showing that people who are most against gun control and still most committed to ideas of national exceptionalism are evangelicals. But to your point about is that theology actively there, explicitly there in most of these debates? I think probably it's not, but I just feel like there's this heritage, particularly with this sort of divide and rule mentality. I think there's an echo of it, but I'm not saying that theology is now, in a Christian sense, a dominant player. But then you look at people like Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz, and in the presidential debates 2016, they did fit into this category in many ways, and they're still talking a very theological language of making deserts glow and all the rest of it. So it is there, I think, in many ways.
Can I push you on this question about how much the theology of innocence is implicated as theology and how much it's implicated as culture? So 17th century Puritans' theology of innocence really does project a sort of a visible sainthood upon the world, and separating a small community, gathered community, from the rest. But and there are certainly large numbers of American religious today who have comparable or descended views, but I wouldn't say most do. There are lots of different kinds of theologies of innocence, amongst American Christians, and so I'm curious as to whether you see significant differences in terms of what Episcopalians learn in church versus what Baptists learn in church versus what Roman Catholics learn in church, in terms of that sense of the self as somehow scrubbed clean, such that they can be, righteous actors in the world, good guys against bad guys.
Yeah. I think that it is quite denominationally divided. I mean, the African American churches and Catholics are almost the polar opposite in terms of their statistics on gun rights and gun control. So there is still that sort of cleavage within the Christian world, but I as in the same as I said in the answer to the previous question, I wouldn't want to say that it's over theologized. It's almost more a set of taken for granted assumptions that are sort of mapped onto the culture. I mean, people like Caroline Lai do not talk about theology at all, although Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz does refer a little bit to this stuff. Not sure that answers the question.
Well, it'd be interesting, just as it's probably work that you can't do, but to think about the Black Baptist churches and the white, Southern Baptist churches, to think about how the theology divides on the question of guns and unites on the question of innocence might be an interesting place to think about whether the theology is effective. One could read sermons and think about what one would imagine to be a common heritage in terms of thinking about original sin within the Baptist community, how it then changes as it goes out into the world, into these very different subject positions.
Yeah, okay, that's helpful, thank you. That's something to develop.
Can I add one? Just to follow on that, it strikes me that there would be very different contexts of enunciation for a Marco Rubio or a Ronald Reagan, who are self-consciously imagining themselves responding to Lincoln and projecting a certain kind of version of what it means to be part of a national community in relation to the issue of gun rights, in which a set of these tropes that you're talking about, the word X'd out, don't worry, will be buried after this conversation, will be almost sort of impossible to overlook, versus your NRA guy who's in a meeting talking about, I don't know what an NRA meeting looks like, so like, has one done ethnographies of NRA meetings, whether it, at that level, is it so symmetrical, the sense of the participation in this culture, gun culture, at this kind of high political level, as at the kind of more mundane level where people might have different kind of
Yeah, I mean it's a similar
ideological commitments.
it's a similar
Yeah.
answer to the point in that about whether Christians are active on on these lists and say, well, no, but we got them anyway. That's the feeling I've got from talking to NRA members who I've got to know in my community, in my neighbourhood, and they'll say that I'm not extreme, I'm not part of all that stuff. But then when it comes to the sort of core positions on foreign policy and what should happen to immigrants who commit crimes, and they're absolutely fit into the mold, but it's not so explicit.
I guess what I mean is, do they think of their AR 15s down in the basement and their gun cat lockers as part of the national project, or do they just think of it as, I just really like this thing, the object of the thing?
Yeah.
I mean, do they have a kind of, do they discriminate?
Oddly enough, that very same example of the AR-15 in the basement,
Right.
My neighbour, it was both.
Yeah.
It was both when I talked about it. Actually, there's a partly it's just I love it and it's fun. We do it at the weekends. We drive around and shoot from the back of a truck. But I think that bedrock of values is there. But I think they do need to be distinguished to do it. Yes.
I have a little bit of an ethnographer's question about some of your subject position in these conversations with, for example, your neighbor, and the extent to which these conversations are, if there's ever kind of a situation where people are saying, well, you're British, so you wouldn't really get it.
Yeah.
Or if this is a logic that can be explained, if they see this as something that they can explain.
Wait, you're
themselves.
British?
Yeah, it's a big problem. I mean, I realised even coming to the benign environs of Berkeley, there were things that were easier to write than say out loud, and it's kind of, it is a problem. But I do feel that I need these relationships with my. I think that sounds really patronising, but I need these friendships. Actually, I was teaching a Sunday school class on sport last Sunday in the big Methodist church in Atlanta, and started talking about Teddy Roosevelt, and then I realised in the conversation that the person I was talking to is an NRA member, and he was inviting me to come along with him the next time there is an event. But I don't know if I've navigated the ethics of how you handle that, and how you. I don't want people to think they can't talk because they're going to end up in a book. And there is an element of, as one person said to me, you're in a hostile sense, you're an ideological visitor to our country. It's like, okay, I'd rather someone said it than thought it. But that there is a clumsiness I acknowledge in the way I've approached this, and I do. It's almost exonerating. I travelled to South Africa in the fall, and I was hearing about from an Afrikaner family about their experience in the Boer War and what the British did, and it's suddenly that the penny does drop eventually to realise, okay, no one's separate. That point about the 20th, no one's innocence. That point about history just still being, won by America to some extent is one that we have to acknowledge, and but it's a big challenge.
So I want to toss out a couple of cautionary notes, and one of them, in a sense, stems from the fact that Increase Mather too was British. And that is about drawing too solid and too uncrooked a line from, let's say, 17th century Massachusetts through Abraham Lincoln to the 21st century United States.
Yeah.
Right? That I find that a problematic move, and similarly in the way that the ambivalence, say, of the Mathers about the chosenness of New England is a thing worth thinking about with respect to the, say, innocence of this. And part of the reason why I want to suggest caution in that regard is exactly because in the kind of theology that modern Americans create for themselves, to say that, and I'm not endorsing this, but to say that, gun owning is as American as Cotton Mather, in a sense, could work to reinforce as much as to use history to challenge that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So I sort of pushed that out there.
Yeah, I agree.
Something for you to think about.
I was trying to sort of emphasise as I went that Mather is very much English. When you read his war narratives, and and they were they were forced to acknowledge the English God. I mean, he really is Anglophone in that sense. The ambivalence of the chosenness, I just find that to be a slightly hollow ambivalence, like the whole idea of the Jeremiad, that we sort of flog ourselves, but we know that it's in the cause of it's going to reinforce our sense of, God chastening those whom we love, that sort of idea. So I still see the self-criticism as part of the self-regard in that sense, but I totally agree with your point about the kind of too solid a line from these people. I mean, really, I've got a series of case studies that revolve around sort of special identity dominating the ethics of violence in different periods, and the chapters, the chapter on the Civil War or on the colonial period are not really about gun rights in this modern sense. So there is an artificial kind of coherence of perhaps this paper, or an attempted coherence, which won't be so crudely put together. But I think with that Gary Wills stuff, that really was an eye-opening moment just reading the book, because I thought, you could be, you're praising this could be Reagan right now, and I suppose I'm, very much on the lumping side of historians, so I have to be careful, but I agree with you on that particularly. Thank you.
Has your study taken into account analyzing these phenomena from the aspect of idolatry, from a theological perspective of seeing the gun as the object? I mean, I've encountered this a lot, including people who will say that, the government can't take away my God-given right to keep and bear arms, which is a funny thing to say to your pastor. Show me. Here's the book. Show me.
Yeah. I suppose the whole thing is about idolatry, really.
Yeah.
Because I'm trying to retain my credibility as a historian and not be. Like the last book, I was like, he's a theologian, so we don't have to. He would say that about. He would say he would have a thing about religion. So there's a bit of a tactical game there, but I think the whole thing is about idolatry.
Yeah.
But initially, it's about the idolatry of a nation and the individual, and then I think it does twist in the sort of, that's part of the sort of postmodern quality of this, is that the gun itself then develops the momentum. And there's a good book by a Presbyterian author, I forget the name, it's called American, and it's Guns, which is all about idolatry, and he quotes examples like that he's saying, as a pastor, you really are, your hands are tied when people. So yes, crudely, and I'd be interested in any sources or ideas on that theme. Reinhold Niebuhr's been quite helpful. Yes.
I'm wondering if in your book you address at all just the seeming acceleration of the dismantling of the separation between church and state in our public politics, and maybe how that ties into what we see as sort of a increasingly radical acceptance of gun culture. And I mean, obviously, you've traced theological ideas of conquest and so forth throughout history, but I'm wondering if you look at that at all in your book.
Yeah. So, do you mean kind of explicitly church and state, or the way in which sort of maybe in Bush era?
Yeah. I'm thinking of the Bush era in particular because the Bush era, even before the war started, there was already this faith-based initiatives program, and he was one of the first, at least during my lifetime, in contemporary history, to really kind of aggressively push for more religion in public life, and that coincided with the war that's still going on today, which a lot of people tie to the emergence of gun culture as well.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering if that's
yes. Is there any? I know John Whitty's done a little bit of stuff on this, but that would definitely relate to this. And I finally, for a long time, been struggling with the idea that is the gun culture ultra modern and nothing to do with this? That it's a sort of phony appropriation of the past, or
is it really old, or is it? And it's this idea of Joan Burbeck talks about sort of Vietnam really as a turning point that sort of regathers some of these fragments of national identity and sort of radicalizes them. But to think of it in those terms of closing that, or closing the gap between church and state, or would be a helpful way of looking at it. So yeah, if you have any sources in mind, then I'd be interested in that.
So I was curious, kind of following up on some of the other questions before, so you're making a historical argument about the kind of depth of the gun culture in American history, and I was just kind of curious if there seems to be a kind of historical sensibility on the part of people who do advocate for gun rights, in the sense that I don't know if there's a kind of coalescence of kind of historical narratives by the NRA, by people like Ted Cruz, or by Wayne LaPierre, or any of these more official spokespeople who do kind of say, well, gun culture in American history begins with, I don't know if it would be something like the frontier, or if it would be, the opposition to the crown, or something like that. Does it seem to be like there's some kind of historical imagination on the part of the people who are advocating these things?
Begins at Lexington and Concord.
Yeah, it really does. I mean, I didn't organise my slides, I'm afraid, but one of them would have been this. There's on the Instagram page of the NRA, it's kind of America, the original safe space created by made by men with guns, and then you've got a man on horseback with a musket, and then you've got a modern person with a handgun. So it's explicitly historical, and it's relentlessly so. The American rifleman is so I suppose it's got historical sensibility, but not that it's well documented that people weren't talking about individual rights in the Second Amendment until really early 70s, I think. So it's heavily historical, but obviously extremely selective.
More to the point of mythological than historical.
Yes,
I mean,
exactly.
It's precisely not historical.
Okay, in that
Right. I mean, it's
It's not critical.
Right. It's heritage oriented. Right?
But there's enough, there's enough truth in it for it to sound extremely persuasive, I think. Somewhere between the two. Brian.
I really enjoyed the talk. And one of the reasons that I find this notion that American gun discourse and gun rights movement is a kind of civic religion is precisely because of the way in which standards for evidence are different in so much of this discourse. And this is a little bit route to get there, but getting back to the comment about African American church earlier, many of the leaders in the African American civil rights movement were gun owners and were encouraging others to be gun owners, but those guys were being shot at and assassinated, and them and their family were in genuine risk, and there was no way to deny that was an objective reality. But so much of the discourse that undergirds the notion that we have to be as armed as the NRA believes we need to be is a threat narrative that operates at a personal level in terms of notions about crime and the vulnerability of people in daily life, and in terms of the threat the state supposedly poses to citizenry that are totally untethered from the facts. And that's not a problem. Like that's this is connected, of course, to the idea that, we can't look into the statistics when it comes to gun violence because that would somehow lead to policies that would encroach on freedom and so forth. So there's a collective agreement to operate in a landscape that does require the invocation of facts and history and arguments about reality, and yet a collective agreement that the standards for those kinds of arguments are going to be different. And that's, I think, as a person, as a lay person when it comes to theology and so forth, I find it attractive to think about this as a civic religion for that reason as well. It's not really a question.
And I think one of the striking things in that book about idolatry was just this point about the almost like the memes, the tired cliches of if you go in if you outlaw guns, only outlaws will have guns, these sort of things. And there was this thing going around for years that there are already 20,000 gun control laws on the books, so it's important just to police those rather than the new ones. I think the most shocking thing there is that the studies that there was a I forget the authors of it, there was a phone survey of random sampled people in Florida asking them if they'd used a gun. I mean, you probably know about this one, but asking if they used a gun in the last 2 months, or in a designated time period, had they used it for defensive uses. And the authors then extrapolated from this that there were 2 million defensive gun uses in America every year. And this study has been debunked literally hundreds of times, and it's clear that there were many, many reasons offered, and people project, so they put events that weren't in that time period, or they just, they rationalise events, or they put some lawyers on a panel and gave them the examples, said most of them were not actually legal uses of gun. It was pulled apart from many levels, but it's still repeated, and that's where you sort of have your head in your hands. You think this stuff is phony, but it still emerges in these kind of Friends of the Court briefs. These are historic moments in redefining the law in this country, and still there are people who want to believe it. So I think it's that's where it's not theological. It's just almost, it really is a pathology. So I don't know how that is going to be unpicked. On the African American thing, yes, I found it quite sobering reading people like Ida B. Wells, one of my heroes, saying that she keeps a Winchester gun in her house, and you need it, and just seeing it from the other side and having it, feeling that if anyone really had a right to defend themselves, it was those whom the police were not protection. So that has helped balance it a little bit. I still don't know where to go with the whole idea that the civil rights movement would have been more effective if it had been armed. I know there are books still arguing this.
Thank you for your talk. It kind of resonated with me because I'm from flyover country, but a very safe part of flyover country, and all my neighbors have arsenals. And I remember having conversations with one of my neighbors. He was explaining to me that he keeps a pistol in his shoe or along his ankle, and a pistol in his back, and he just has several pistols. I asked him why he needed all these guns, and he had these stories about possible criminals popping up everywhere. And I just said, where is this coming from? We live in this one of the safest cities in the nation. And so it was really interesting listening to your talk from that angle. But my question is actually about the point about American exceptionalism in this story and nationalism, because you ground some of your comments about innocence in Tolstoy's comment about how nationalism is a religion that legitimizes violence. And then we move to America. And is America exceptional just because it has a lot of guns? Do you understand my question? Yeah. Is this a question of nationalism in the way that nationalism legitimizes violence? And this is just
I think what I was trying to I felt a sense of relief reading Tolstoy that this is not a purely American problem. It's probably something that is owing to the stage in history that a historic period of dominance, and that really if you think of nationalism as a form of egoism, everyone has been guilty of it to some extent. And then that quote from Yakovlev was to say, well, even the secular ideology, in fact, not even more so, where you have this simple typology of those on the wrong side of history, then that can become a rationale for violence. But in a sense, I'm trying to de-exceptionalize the story by saying many nations have been at it, and the history of the church is riddled with it. But I want to sharpen the lens a little bit on the theology and not just say, religion's bad, religion's the cause of violence. And say, well, what can't that's why Spinoza is such a useful person, and Feuerbach in the 19th century. So you've got to look at particular theologies of grace. He talks more about justification by faith alone being a very dangerous doctrine in history. So I'm trying to put it within wider historical patterns, but also be more precise about the kind of theology that nurtures it.
So she's been trying to get in for a while.
Sorry.
I'm fascinated by all this. So I really appreciated your talk because it made me think of so many things. I'm hesitant to even ask a question because I have so many ideas popping around in my head right now. So I'll try and see if I can turn it into a couple of thoughts or questions. So thank you. Thought-provoking is always the best thing. So one of the things, it's really interesting to me that this is about guns, and I think what you're doing is helping reframe that it's not just about guns, right? And I can't see the flyover country person over here, but I come from a very Midwestern, we went hunting, everybody has a gun, and actual gun violence and murder and suicides and with guns, and a very Christian background. So everything is basically been in my family personally, so I've always been really intrigued by how you tease apart what's what. So that sort of fits a little bit into the modern statistics that you started off with around the bulk of individuals who are harmed by gun violence is very personal. It's very relational. It's a lot of domestic violence, it's disputes, and so why are they solved by guns? What's the culture that gets us to that? And then the other thing on the history, so I'm trying to marry these two things, because one's the modern era we live in, right, where that's what I would think we're trying to stop the harm from, the violence that individuals feel they can do, and then guns are the means by which it's done. Right, and so then what is our response? And so a lot of times it's, well, it's not necessarily more gun control if you don't actually control the violent behavior and assumptions around, you said patriarchy, other things that a man can go shoot a, the most recent gun shooting in America this week was a man shooting his girlfriend and his kid, da-da-da-da. But if you take that back to the history, one of the things I'm really interested in is comparative analysis, and I love the breakdown of the different religions and all of that. But it's us like even versus Canada. So I also love the part you talked about the genocide of the Native Americans, because, and this has really struck with me, I don't know how many people here saw the movie Revenant, which is the story basically of how violent we are as a country, where we were, formed through extraction and genocide, and effectively in the movie rape. Native Americans and a culture and everyone, and it's all male, and it's all shooting each other, all for furs and, raccoon pelts, and et cetera. Not raccoons, beaver. And that's Canada and the United States, right? And that whole history was there. And there might have been religion and manifest destiny and all of that, because it's very European. But if you marry, I saw that movie, I'm like, yeah, we were born out of violence. This is a country born and created, a white country, if you want to think about that way, because Native Americans were here, born out of violence. So if you take the violent thread, that sort of capitalist extraction, by any means necessary, we have the right to it, right? Whether it's Native women, whatever. And then you fast forward that to now and sort of say, now you've got this individual sort of challenge of domestic relationships, bar fights, et cetera, arming each other. How do you marry all of that with Canada doesn't seem to have the same problem we have, right? How much of this is about men and women's relationships and violence and access to guns? I mean, what problem are we actually trying to solve by having a deeper understanding of the culture that gets us these results? Way back from the history to today, where someone's going to get shot today as we sit here talking. And it's probably going to be somebody in a family situation of some violence where somebody had access to.
Yeah, I suppose I'm not saying that daily violence is directly rooted in the ideology of innocence, but the fact that there are so many guns and there's so little will to challenge it is rooted in the wider theory. So once you get into a debate about gun control, you're back in there. But I suppose it's people this, people say, oh, look what happened to Australia. They had this massacre, more than 30 people died, and then the government quickly acted. But you read Australian history, and I almost feel so embarrassed saying, but there was a quote from one book I was reading the other day saying that Australia as a penal colony did not have a sense of messianic identity. I'm not saying I
It's a
can.
very macho culture with a
It's a
lot of,
macho culture,
you
but
know,
it's also quite a practical culture. And the other question is, Canada. You mentioned there is a frontier, but there isn't a gun culture in the same sense. There's a hunting culture. So that's why I'm kind of groping for an ideology. But I admit that on what it's come to be is beyond that in the practical daily affairs. And maybe there is this sort of, and that's a point that Tolstoy makes, that an act of violence creates a reaction, and then there's a sort of there's a sort of chain effect. So there's a degree to which it just is, and then not every act of violence is religious, even though the culture is to some extent religious.
But to me, the fascinating question is, and I take from all that long rambling I just did, I think we are a violent country, and I think we have a high tolerance for it. And then we add to that, whether it's domestic violence in your home or taking on the problem of the world or something in between, or whatever. Then we add at the point of a gun, right? So what is it about that somehow allowed the gun culture to be, the guns to be the manifestation of that culture? So that, and some of it I found fascinating to your part about religion, having experienced the very strong Christian religion growing up, that is probably does help tolerate it, right? So
it's a
those
factor.
themes, it seems like it's really interesting to tease out how much is what, because if the goal is to be historians looking back, 100 years from now at this point in time and say, did everything just stay the same? This is our culture, this is who we are, this is how we were founded, we didn't change. Or was there something that allowed us to see ourselves differently? We can change.
Pamela Hart's book on the gunning of America is very helpful corrective to some of the approaches I'm taking, just by saying that there is a dynamic of business and entrepreneurialism, and that's a factor. It's a huge factor.
Yeah.
So I don't want to overstate. I see these ideas as enablers, not active causes per se. So I think there's a range of influences there.
I think our time is done, however. So I think, could you please join me?